Hello humans, and welcome back to another episode of the Housepod, a podcast where we explore practical issues and applications of faith. Today we're looking at the question of why some Christians are uncomfortable being called sister or brother by other Christians. Our research has centered on the psychological and sociological perspectives behind this question, and today we'll be sharing these findings with you. My name is Natalie Kendel. I am a theologian and pastor here at the house, and I'll be facilitating our journey into this topic. I'm joined today by Sarah and Nicole. For the purpose of this podcast, their names and voices have been changed for their protection and privacy. In many Christian congregations, particularly within evangelical, Pentecostal, and historically black church traditions, it is common to refer to fellow believers as brother or sister. This language is drawn from the biblical metaphors of the church as a spiritual family, seen, for example, in the book of Romans chapter 12, verse 10, or Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11. And the use of these terms often have the intention of fostering unity and belonging. However, for some believers, these terms, especially when used casually or institutionally, evoke discomfort rather than warmth. Despite a deep and committed faith, many find themselves recoiling from being addressed as sister so-and-so and brother, and also struggle perhaps to articulate why. We're going to be exploring some of the historical and experiential reasons why such language may feel alienating or even harmful to some, and why church leaders and communities should have an increased mindfulness of its impact. Sarah, Nicole, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Sarah, I'll begin by inviting you to share a bit of your experience with being called sister in your hometown congregation. How has that played out for you?
So I've been a Christian all my life, and my family attends a congregational worship every week. And every time I step into that building, I am magically transformed into this other character called Sister Sarah. When I am part of the singing team, I'm introduced as Sister Sarah. When the pastor refers to me up front, I am called our sister, our dear sister, etc. And that's how it's been for years. The thing is, though, I really don't care for it. And I sort of internally cringe whenever one of the deacons or the reverend calls me that. And part of me thought for a long time that I just didn't like it based on nothing specifically. Especially in my teenage years, I thought I might not like it because I was being rebellious or picky, or maybe because it made me sound like some old nun or something like that. But as I've gotten into my 20s, I've realised that one of the reasons I don't enjoy being called Sister Sarah is because I never agreed to be addressed like this by my church family. It was a term or a word thrust upon me, and done so without my consent or agreement.
So you discovered that there was, in fact, a concrete reason behind why you didn't care for that term.
Exactly. It wasn't some baseless response or something that went away as I grew up.
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. And Nicole, did you have a similar experience, or was your dislike of being called sister based on other reasons?
I definitely had similar reasons to Sarah. And I also thought that maybe not liking being called that was part of being a young person in church. But I soon saw that this wasn't the case. So I didn't quite have the same beginning as Sarah. I didn't grow up in the church. I started attending some Alpha Course meetings after I moved to London, mainly because I'd moved away from all my friends and didn't really know anyone. And so I saw this poster one day that welcomed people to join this course where we explored Christianity and Christian beliefs. At that point, I was just curious, to be honest. But after a few weeks, I realized that this was something for me. The course was speaking to a lot of the questions I'd been having about life, and so I kept going. And eventually, I started attending a church in London regularly. The first day I walked in, I was greeted by very friendly people at the door. They asked me if it was my first time, and I said yes. They asked my name, and as soon as I replied Nicole, they sort of defaulted into, "Welcome, Sister Nicole." And there was something that just didn't feel right there. Like with Sarah, it was just difficult to put my finger on what it was, but I think if I'm remembering correctly, I just kept thinking, you don't know me, and I'm your sister now. So yeah, that was my experience with it.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Nicole. It seems that in both the case of someone who grew up in a faith community and for someone who entered quite fresh into it in adulthood, both had similar reactions to being given this title of sister. And both also experienced a period of not quite knowing why that was. Well, Sarah and Nicole, and to anyone else who's listening, I'd like to assure you that you're not alone in feeling the way you do, or in the journeys that you've had with this experience. There are many Christians and visitors to churches out there who also feel the same way. They might find the language awkward, some find it impersonal, some find it overly familiar, and others exclusionary, stating that they prefer to be called by their given names or preferred pronouns. Well, let's have a look into some of the psychological or sociological backdrop to this dynamic, because there's actually very logical and reasonable origins behind why automatically calling others sister or brother can be harmful or unwelcomed. Number 1, impersonal language that masks individual identity. Religious language, like any institutional discourse, can become formulaic. If you step into any kind of group dynamic or institutional culture, you'll often find that they have their own sort of language. They might refer to each other in a particular way, or use certain internally understood code to refer to their shared group experiences or knowledge. And the presence of this shared symbolism and institutional discourse also plays out in church culture and church groups. This isn't always a bad thing. It can, for example, be practically useful. Having a shorthand, a quicker code for saying something which has immense meaning and weighty context behind it can save time and communicate a lot by not having to say a lot. For example, if a church wants to communicate to a girl or woman in that group, we recognize our connection to you. You are welcome here. You are part of this family and group. Why is that the case? Because we are all adopted into the same spiritual family by God. A family connection based on our mutual faith, with God as our Father and Jesus as our brother. This family metaphor is one Jesus talked about, and so did the apostles. How God is building a new type of family, not based on the will of men, or blood, or genetics, but based on faith and mutual love. And so we honor and see and accept you, sister, into our community. But instead of saying that whole speech every time, the church may just use the sister shorthand, meant to communicate all that in a quicker way. A problem with this is that, as we said at the beginning, institutional discourse can become formulaic. It can become habitual, a knee-jerk response, where the individuals, or even the entire group, lose sight of the whole long speech about why we use this term. And slowly it becomes a habit. It becomes an empty tradition. It's just the way it is, with no thought behind it, no intended meaning behind it. And in fact, this formula can be used not as a shorthand to communicate all those things, warmth, belonging, acceptance, respect, but rather a way to circumvent having to deal with the person as an individual. It's a way to avoid having to see this human being in front of you as a complex, unique person. And instead of getting to know them, asking their name, for their interests, their story, the reason they're there, instead of entering that complex and beautiful dance of conversation, relationship, caring, empathy, seeing the other person, sometimes church members bypass that entire process and just jump to the sister shortcut. The problem is, when spiritual kinship terms are used indiscriminately, they can feel less like expressions of genuine relationship and more like signs of group membership. In fact, this dynamic has been well documented in organizational psychology, where role-based language can create a sense of depersonalization, or something called role engulfment. Role engulfment is a term rooted in the work of sociologist Ralph H. Turner. In his 1978 publication, Turner introduced the idea of role-person merger. This phenomenon, where an individual's identity becomes so intertwined with a particular social role that it dominates their self-concept. This merger can result in the individual perceiving themselves primarily through the lens of that role, potentially leading to a sense of depersonalization. If you'd like to read some in-depth studies on this, you can find some sources in the description box below this video. For example, the research paper by Susan and Robert Klein, titled Exploring How Role Identity Development Stage Moderates Person-Possession Relations. But back to Turner. He was talking about how an individual's identity can become so enmeshed with a certain role they play or hold in a group that they have no identity to themselves or to the group outside that role. Now, how could this play out in a church dynamic? Well, for one, it can create an internal church culture that assigns people value based on their roles or functions, based on their productivity or perceived usefulness. If people start believing this as truth about themselves, they will, for example, fight tooth and nail to protect their given title or role or function. The pastor, if he feels threatened at all by someone who doesn't seem to be paying homage to his seemingly higher position in the church hierarchy, will respond defensively when threatened, will respond with pride or jealousy when there's a new pastoral intern that others seem to like more than him, or a church elder could cling to their elder position and instead of training, empowering, and mentoring others for her to pass the torch to, instead of her preparing for continuity and celebrating the empowerment of others, she'll tie her value up in her role as elder. She'll fight as if that role seems threatened. She'll put her feelings of value and belonging into that basket. And if we look at this more generally, affecting everyone in a church, well, if I'm not an individual, I'm not truly seen for the unique and valuable person I am by the others in a church, then my only qualifier for all those things my title sister was meant to include, belonging, warmth, acceptance, respect, do all of those things then suddenly stop being true if I don't fulfill my role in that group? If I am no longer a believer, if I leave a church, if I am ostracized because of my differing in beliefs or behavior, does this mean that my entire identity to them crumbles? I would venture to say that this is one of the key reasons why many, although wishing to leave toxic, harmful churches, or wishing to leave for theological reasons, don't. Because their identity has been enmeshed with that church or with that congregation, and to leave would feel like a loss of oneself, although of course that was never meant to be the case. Turner's insights on these dynamics have been influential in various fields, including consumer behavior research. For instance, a study on role identity development discusses how individuals, as they commit more deeply to a role, begin to define themselves predominantly by that role, illustrating Turner's concept of role-person merger. A person's identity becomes completely tied into a role within a group. I can attest to that this dynamic is very real. While I was at university studying theology, there were a few different congregations and church services that on-campus students could go to during the Sabbath. And one of these congregations was called the Contemporary Service. This service was marketed as being the alternative, the more youthful, the less conservative liturgically. It was sort of meant to be all about the younger demographic, and the music was meant to be a reflection of this younger group. Supposedly, the music was meant to reflect a more contemporary Christian music style. But the style of most of the music the song leaders and musicians ever played was Hillsong and similar music, Hillsong from the 90s. I attended from 2007. And so the music style wasn't in fact contemporary at all. What had happened in this church was this. The song team was led mainly by Gen X's and sometimes even by boomers. These were the regular singers and musicians, and they were known for quite jealously hogging anything to do with the music in this church. These individuals had sort of created a narrative for themselves that they were young, cutting-edge, innovative worshippers, fresh thinkers. Some of them dressed like this as well. But what everyone else actually saw was a group of middle-aged men and women who couldn't seem to let go of their past identity of being the youngest and freshest in a church. And it was like seeing a 50-year-old man going through a middle-age crisis, refusing the fact that he's getting older. This created an interesting dynamic, where it was notoriously hard. People would talk about how difficult it was for other musicians, new singers, to get at all involved in the music at the contemporary service. You could ask, you could offer your services, but it was difficult to sort of get in. Why? Because this group of older musicians, trying to hold on to their glory days, were feeling threatened by newcomers. Instead of making way and supporting new musicians, the song team felt their very place in that church was being threatened because they had tied their value and their place in that group to this function, this role, or this mode, leading, of course, to poor handoff to other musicians and to a service that was very far from contemporary. Now, Turner's original work focused on the sociological aspects of role identity, but additional research has explored the psychological implications, such as the potential for depersonalization, when one's self-concept becomes overly enmeshed with a specific role. The loss of a feeling of personhood, the loss of individuality, and one's own identity being lost. All of this means that a person coming into a church and, without their agreement, being automatically assigned a title, also denoting a role, can be experienced by that person as a depersonalizing event, a denial of their individuality and individual uniqueness and value, just for being them. Many people in the world have already had a lot of harmful experiences with not being treated as a person. Particularly in a Western capitalistic matrix, we find that people are often dehumanized. When you step into a hospital, you are often just another patient with a number. You will be seen for this many minutes and given a general assessment, and you will not be treated in a bespoke manner according to your specific needs, but you'll be forced into some sort of box that suits the medical practitioner's timetable and skill. And the same is true of mental health care and workplace situations. You are a number to the government. You are a piece of code in a computer somewhere. Most people in Western society are already boiled down to their productivity, what they do, what they produce, their allocated roles, a function they can perform, or their identity to others revolves around something very narrow and not at all inclusive of the full complexity of personhood. Most of our societal institutions treat human beings like they are numbers, cattle, case files, letters in a spreadsheet. Our value is constantly being reduced to our income, our marital status, our weight, our wealth, our profession, our educational level, our clothes, our ability to fit seamlessly into an impossibly restrictive, oversimplified, ableistic, neurotypical, superficial society. And we as persons, as humans, are not seen as what we are, and very few are willing to pursue seeing us as individual persons with individual needs and thought processes and stories. And then these depersonalized, dehumanized people step into a church and once again are met with the washing away of their individuality. They are just absorbed into the whole, no longer to be a person worth getting to know and truly see. When someone is addressed primarily as sister or brother, it may feel as though their individuality is being subordinated to a predefined role within the group. For those who value authenticity and mutual knowing, this can trigger a sense of invisibility in a big way. Does that resonate in any way with you, Sarah and Nicole?
Yes, absolutely. I'd never heard it put in that way before, but hearing this institutional discourse being described, yes, that's it. I think that's what I meant when I felt like you don't even know me.
That makes a lot of sense, and I can see why you think that. And there's a lot of research to affirm you that your reaction was very normal and reasonable. The second aspect which can play into this issue is something called assumed intimacy without relational groundwork. Sociologist Brené Brown has written and spoken about this dynamic. So terms like brother or sister denotes kinship, connection. But what happens when that kinship, that connection, doesn't actually exist in the group? Sister implies a level of closeness and mutual commitment that may not exist in reality. And that makes this title of sister feel dishonest. Dishonest about the state of the true relationship between two people in the same group, or between the group and the individual. Identifying a girl or woman as sister, although it might be intended to produce feelings of welcome, belonging, if that connection is assumed or false, then that denoted warmth actually denies the reality. Perhaps the reality of how that girl or woman is treated within the group, perhaps denying the reality of the level of effort that group has made to build a genuine relationship with her, or denying the true nature of that group's relational health. Sociologist Brené Brown refers to this as faux intimacy. It's the use of intimate language in the absence of genuine connection. You can read more about this in her book, Braving the Wilderness. In this book, she gives an example of faux intimacy where she introduces the term common enemy intimacy. This refers to the phenomenon where individuals form connections based on shared dislike or hatred toward a common adversary, rather than through genuine understanding and vulnerability. For example, two friends may bond over mutual hatred of a third party, or may connect by gossiping about others. This is not true connection or intimacy, but it mimics relationship. And sadly, many friendships are based mainly on this false foundation. Brown emphasizes that such connections are counterfeit and do not foster true belonging. In the same way, if an individual's needs for connection, to be seen and truly heard, to be respected, honored, treated with dignity, and known, is not met, but still has a term of faux intimacy like sister or brother thrust upon them, it is depersonalizing, and also a type of erasure of their individual being. And if they experience this in church, it's just reflecting and echoing what they are already experiencing in large pockets of the rest of the world. And so church is not an improvement. It offers no better alternative that is a community that's real, honest, takes accountability. To be among Christians should be an experience of having your humanity held and seen with a dignity and service and compassion which far outruns what is experienced in society, but this is not always the case. Additionally, if faux intimacy is taking up the oxygen in the room, there is no room for true intimacy, for true human connection and true love. When relational terms are used as placeholders rather than earned through relationship, they can feel intrusive. Why wouldn't they? In fact, in communication theory, this is known as a violation of relational expectancy, where assumptions about familiarity conflict with personal boundaries, as laid out in Judy K. Burgoon's 1993 article.
I think this one really connects with my experience. It really strikes at what I've felt. Don't get me wrong, I love my church, I care a lot about the people in it, and I am very grateful to have grown up in such an environment. But also, I'm not, how shall I put this? I'm not best friends with everyone in my church. You know, I have different levels of relationships with people, and some are close and others are not. Some are not good. Some are trustworthy. Others are not good at all. And I think that there's this, sort of like by calling me Sister Sarah, it can falsely release people from the responsibility of actually getting to know me or actually building a good relationship with me. And yes, as you were talking about there, it feels like pretending that there's this whole deep connection that isn't actually there. And that feels to me like lying. And also like an excuse not to do better, not to actually make the effort to build that relationship. Don't get me wrong. I don't expect everyone at my church to be my best friend. Not everyone be, and I wouldn't want everyone to be that close to me. But then let's maybe stop with the term that suggests we are, if that makes any sense.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad this description could bring some words to the feeling and clarify some of what you've been experiencing.
Definitely. The term faux intimacy was new to me, although I have read Brené Brown's stuff before, but I might buy that book now.
Great, it sounds like that could be a useful resource. Let's now look at our third dynamic, which can be a contributing factor. This one is called trauma association and emotional safety. Sister and brother are originally familial terms. For some people, familial language used in religious settings may carry painful associations from previous trauma, childhood trauma, family trauma. This could include unsafe or abusive family relationships, church environments with authoritarian or patriarchal structures, or spiritual abuse masquerading as community or submission. According to trauma-informed care frameworks, even seemingly benign language can trigger adverse emotional responses if it mirrors past harmful dynamics. In her 1992 seminal work, Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery explores how traumatic experiences, particularly those involving prolonged abuse, can disrupt an individual's sense of safety, trust, and control. And she emphasizes that trauma survivors may develop heightened sensitivity to certain cues, including language that resembles aspects of their past trauma, leading to re-traumatization. And so in such cases, sister may not feel like an honorific. It may feel like an alarm bell. If this point seems like it's coming out of left field, then I would challenge you to consider the sheer statistical likelihood of a woman or girl with childhood and familial trauma entering your church building. The likelihood is very high, simply based on the percentage of girls and women who experience this type of abuse and their vast majority in society. Being aware of our language is part of being trauma-informed. It's not overly catering or emotional coddling of a minority. It is the responsible and compassionate meeting with the pain of a majority. The fourth point on our list is gendered expectations and role confinement. The term sister is not value neutral. Within certain church cultures, it often comes bundled with expectations regarding a woman's behavior, responsibilities, and spiritual posture. For example, being nurturing, deferential, or quietly supportive. Feminist theologians and gender scholars have long noted that religious language can absolutely reinforce patriarchal gender roles, often without conscious intent. In her seminal work, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, Phyllis Tribal, in 1978, employed feminist hermeneutics to analyze Hebrew Bible texts. She argued that traditional interpretations have often been shaped by patriarchal biases, leading to readings that reinforce male dominance. Tribal's close readings aim to uncover the underlying egalitarian messages in the scriptures, challenging the conventional patriarchal interpretations. For instance, she re-examines the creation narratives in Genesis, suggesting that the texts, when read with patriarchal presuppositions, do not inherently support gender hierarchy. In Rosemary Radford Ruether's Sexism and God Talk Toward a Feminist Theology, Ruether critiques the patriarchal structures embedded within Christian theology. She contends that the traditional male-dominated imagery and language about the divine have perpetuated gender inequality within religious contexts. Ruether advocates for a reimagining of theological language that promotes inclusivity and reflects the full humanity of all individuals, not because it would suit us better or because it sounds nicer, but because it's actually more biblically accurate. Ruether rightly challenges the deep-seated patriarchal norms in religious traditions. Both of these scholars highlight how entrenched patriarchal perspectives in religious language and interpretation can unconsciously perpetuate gender roles. Their works call for a critical reassessment of theological language to foster a more inclusive and equitable understanding of the divine and human relations. And so, when sister is used in church settings, it may subtly, whether intentionally or not, confine women to secondary or supporting roles in the spiritual life of the community. For women who are leaders, theologians, teachers, or creatives, this term can feel diminishing, flattening their contribution into a gendered mold, and it's almost a way to put them in their place. Calling a girl or woman sister is meant to be a term expressing full inclusion, a dignifying and honouring of that girl or woman. But it has often been made all about prompting compliance, unassertiveness, docility, tameness, and assent. Like you would say, "sit boy" to your dog. And calling a girl or woman sister has often been a shorthand for a boy or man signalling his expectation of how she ought to behave and conduct herself, not based on the Christ-centered community values in actual scripture, but based on the misogyny-hijacked theology deeply embedded in much church culture and theological understanding. And so sister can be experienced as an oppressive term, not superficially, but because of the massive reality of actual oppression behind that terminology. Number 5 on our list is the lack of consent and the question of agency. The term brother and sister are rarely requested, they are imposed. In cultures of high religious conformity, such as some conservative or charismatic movements, this naming may feel compulsory. As both you, Sarah, and Nicole described, you were at no time asked if this was a term you'd want. You are simply expected to accept being called sister. And here is where we come to something deeply personal and deeply rooted in identity: naming. The concept of naming carries very significant power, both biblically and psychologically. To name someone is to assume the role of framing their identity within a narrative. When there's a shift in a person's narrative, in their journey, God sometimes renames them in the Bible. Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, Simon to Peter. It indicates a recreating, God taking an ownership or responsibility role as parent or creator. Someone's name is deeply personal. It is how they are identified by other people. And when that naming occurs without consent, it can be experienced as a subtle form of control, particularly for individuals who have had to reclaim their autonomy after past disempowerment. This is an experience very common for many girls and women. And finally, our 6th and last point is titled Historical and Cultural Origins of Kinship Terminology. Now, historically, the use of familial titles in Christian communities has deep roots in both scripture and ecclesial tradition. We've already touched on this. However, its modern implementation is heavily shaped by denominational culture, colonial mission models, and hierarchical church structures. In some contexts, especially during the holiness and Pentecostal revivals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, brother and sister functioned as leveling terms that transcended class, race, and denomination. But over time, their institutionalization instead often reflected and reinforced power dynamics rather than dismantling them. In her review on open renewal, Kimberly Irvin Alexander reflects on how brother and sister initially served as egalitarian terms within the holiness and Pentecostal movements, but over time became institutionalized and reflective of secular power dynamics. First, Alexander reflects on her Pentecostal upbringing, noting that such titles were used to foster a sense of equality among congregants, regardless of their societal status or official positions. She observes that this practice was part of a broader democratization of the Spirit, where any member, regardless of former title, could be seen as a vessel of divine messages. However, she then goes on to write about how, as the movements grew and became more structured, these terms began to lose their original egalitarian significance, sometimes reinforcing existing hierarchies instead, hierarchies of race, gender, class. If you'd like to read more about that, you can check out The New Spirituality by Kimberly Irvin Alexander, published in 1997. R.S. Sugirtharajah examines in his work, The Bible and the Third World, published by Cambridge University Press, how such language, while seemingly fostering intimacy, was in fact instrumental in establishing hierarchical relationships that mirrored colonial power structures, the white church fathers and the brown children converts. He delves into the ways biblical interpretation and missionary practices were intertwined with colonial ideologies, leading to the reinforcement of authority over indigenous populations. You can read this particularly in Chapter 8 of his book, Postcolonializing Biblical Interpretation, where Sugirtharajah discusses the implications of these practices in greater detail. So, for some, the terminology of sister and brother, and calling priests father and nuns mother, can be damaging and hold a colonial and imperial oppressive memory, or present reality. So, to sum up, language in spiritual communities matters. It does more than convey information, it creates atmosphere, it constructs relationships, and it either invites or it alienates. While some believers may experience sister or brother as affirming, and their experience is valid, others may experience it as distancing, presumptive, or even triggering. So, what do we then conclude? Do we just keep bulldozing over those harmed by this language and ignore them? Or do we do away with the terms entirely? Well, the goal here is not to abolish these terms wholesale, but to learn and practice consent. To use these terms thoughtfully and only with true relational integrity, and only with the consent of the receiver. Churches that value safety, authenticity, and mutual respect have to be attentive not just to what they say, but how it lands. And it's so easy to ask someone the question. Ask permission, ask for consent, and respect whatever answer you receive, and accept that consent can be given and withdrawn at any time, and as many times as the person wishes. Above all, we must remember belonging cannot be manufactured through language alone. It must be earned through presence, care, and the kind of love and respect that listens first, before naming. I'd like to thank you both, Sarah and Nicole, for joining us today, for sharing of your experiences and giving of your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure, and also really interesting.
I'm glad. And to everyone else who joined us today, we wish you good things and kindness. You'll find a full list of the sources referred to in this episode in the description below. If you want to listen to more episodes of the Housepod, feel free to subscribe and follow us. And you'll also find a host of Bible stories and music and all sorts of other videos here on the House's channel. Please do go check them out. Also, brand new to our channel, you can now become a channel premium member. Get early access to videos, bespoke emojis and reactions, and lots of other perks too. Signing up to becoming a member is not intended as a way to elevate or separate some channel visitors from others. Instead, we set it up as a great and easy way you can support the work we're doing here. So if that sounds like something you'd like to do, you can go to our channel, click the tab where it says membership, and then take it from there. Until next time, bye from us at the Housepod. See you later.